1. This story takes place in a small Canadian city this past spring, just as the snow had melted and going outdoors became bearable once again. So May. I had been living with my parents all winter, so the season change arrived just in time to prevent my stir craziness. After work, I like to break up my routine and venture out of the house, even if just to go for a drive. Those were my thoughts on the evening this story is set. I hadn't seen one of my good friends in a few weeks, since our work schedules often conflicted. When we did have some time, we would normally park somewhere secluded and smoke a few joints. This happened regularly enough that we just ended up at The Spot, our de facto meeting location. The Spot was located on the campus of a local college, on the outer edge of the city. It was easily accessible to us both, was relatively quiet, and there was never a cop to be seen. There were normally a few people parked at various points around the parking lot, probably doing the same thing we were, but we kept out of each other's business. By night, the sea of empty parking stalls felt entirely our own. My friend and I arrived at the Spot a little after 9 p.m. We parked in a small lot adjacent to a much larger one because we didn't want to be noticeable. The lots had one main entrance to the road, and were separated to the left, ours, and the right. Also to the left was the roadway toward a campus building, which looped around to the building's front entrance and exited through the parking lot where we were. From our parking spot, we had full view of the main entrance, as well as anyone coming or going from the larger lot. However, a number of huge elm and pine trees obscured our view of the larger parking lot, creating a sense of seclusion from anyone who may be over there. We turned off the car and began to catch up, chatting and laughing for what seemed like hours. We opened the window to air out the car and began to hear a distant voice coming from beyond the trees. A man seemed to be speaking frantically to someone, although we could not hear another person. Several minutes of this went by, and then he finally appeared. From a distance, we saw him illuminated under one of the campus street lamps. He appeared to be a young man dressed in a t-shirt and blue jeans, and was clearly yelling into his phone. He was too far away to make out any other characteristics. He began to walk down the main entrance toward the road, away from my car, and eventually disappeared into the dark. We had been on edge since we first heard the voice, so we were relieved to see him walk in the other direction. 20 minutes passed, and we had all but forgotten about him, quickly getting back to the details of each other's latest highs and lows. Our city is known to be somewhat dangerous at night, but we didn't feel much danger near the college. It had become our philosophy that anyone approaching our cars at night did not have good intentions, but we had the distinct advantage of 4 wheels and an engine. As we continued to talk, something started to feel out of place. In my periphery, I began to catch flickers of movement from the shadows toward the road. I turned to the right and saw this same man walking back toward the parking lots from the road. This time he was no longer on his phone. We watched him in a slight daze for a few moments. He kept a steady pace and walked a straight line in our direction. He was still several hundred feet away, but a sense of eeriness began to build. We both expected that he would turn back to the large lot, to his car somewhere past the trees. He did not. It became clear that he was walking directly toward my car. As he passed under a street lamp, we saw it, a long solid bar in his right hand. At this point, a crushing wave of terror soon came over us both. "Go! Go! Go!" my friend screamed in my ear. I started the car and put it in reverse. I turned away from him and toward the campus building, hoping to escape by circling the loop and exiting through the roadway's entrance. As I pressed the accelerator, I caught a glimpse of him. He was sprinting through the trees to block us off at the entrance. About halfway around the loop, I stopped and began to turn around. My fight or flight response was in full effect, and we had chosen the latter. The size of the roadway meant I had to do a 2 or 3-point turn, kicking my adrenaline into overdrive. My friend began to scream again, He's running right toward us. He had abandoned his plan to block us at the entrance, and began to run directly toward the car. The distance between us quickly shrank. Finally, I was able to turn around. The maneuver likely took 10 seconds, but felt so much longer. My foot hit the gas and I sped back around the loop. I now had a full view of the figure sprinting again through the trees, trying to trap us for a second time. I sped through the parking lot where we had sat peacefully a few minutes before. Just as I made it to the exit, he appeared on the left out of the trees. My foot was still on the gas. Because it was so fast, I still didn't get a good look at him. All I remember is the angry look on his face, his teeth bared and perhaps yelling in defeat. He had his arms thrown up in the air with that solid object still in his right hand. We sped down the road and further into the city. My heart rate didn't return to normal for half an hour. We drove around for a little bit, stunned and recounting the details of what had just happened. We were eventually able to laugh about it, thinking about how dumb we were for allowing ourselves to get trapped so easily. We didn't go back to the spot again. The backyard seemed like a better fit for us. Perhaps this man had a broken-down car, or perhaps he was a parking enforcement officer. I like to think there is some rational explanation, and that we did not almost get mugged, assaulted, or murdered. That said, I'm glad we didn't stick around to find out. So, let's not meet. 2. This happened about 4 years back. I'm 23 now and was 19 or 20 at the time I dealt with this guy, who after our initial contact, proceeded to stalk me a few months later. For background, I'm a gay Hispanic male in the US. I had only been out of the closet for about a few months when I first downloaded Grindr, and was dipping my foot in the dating and meetup scene. I actually made friends through the app, and had some pretty decent dates up to this point. Anyway, one day I had this actually very handsome guy, white, early 30s fit, etc., message me and wanted to meet up at some point. Given my overall good experience with the app at that point, I was entertaining the idea and we were planning something out when I received some bad news. On that note, I had to tell him I was going to be out of town with an explanation as to why and apologetically cancelled. He freaks out. I'm used to guys being upset when something doesn't go as planned or when I'm just generally not interested. But this was on a level I had never experienced before nor since. The messages were longer and a lot more twisted, but along the lines of, "Faggots like you are what corrupt this earth. The day is coming where you'll all get what you deserve. Don't think that you're safe," etc. I remember as well that I was responding, but he wasn't acknowledging my replies, which made the whole exchange all the more menacing, as if he was just repressing all of this and it exploded out. Of course I blocked him after that, being really creeped out at the messages, and figured he was just some self-loathing gay man. Also to clarify, the conversation itself was over the course of a single hour. This becomes important for perspective later. Fast forward 8 months later, I'm living in the same city, started dating a pretty good guy, and hadn't been on the app in some time. I'm walking downtown to some event I was meeting some friends at, and happened to cross paths with the guy. I didn't recognize him. As I pointed out earlier, our text conversation was over the course of a single hour, 8 months ago. But he sure remembered me. He steps directly into my path and starts yelling at me and tries to push me down. I was pretty shaken, not understanding what was happening at this point. But I start yelling back and lunge at him in self-defense, which I don't think he expected as he seemed thrown off. The downtown area has fairly heavy foot traffic, so some other people got involved, seeing that this guy just started attacking me rather randomly. Thankfully, due to their intervention, the guy scoffed and ran away, but all the while was throwing me the ugliest glare. As I walked away from the encounter, I kept replaying it through my head, and then I remembered where he knew me from. The connection between him harassing me and the messages he sent really creeped me out to the point where I cried and called my boyfriend. Sadly, he didn't realize the gravity of it, and dismissed the guy as just some random crazy, which didn't help the situation. Thankfully, my friends I met up with later comforted me, and made sure to keep a watch around me the remainder of the day. After that encounter, I started to notice that guy at several different places. I worked downtown. I noticed him several times outside of my workplace just watching me. Other times I would just be walking down the pedestrian mall nearby, and he would be there, and if he was walking, he would stop in his tracks and just stare at me until I was out of eyesight. I would figure that the time where he yelled at me and tried to push me down was the first time he had seen me. So considering I was seeing him rather frequently at this point, made me believe he had somehow figured out the place I worked at and where I frequented. I started to make it a point to change shifts and go to other places in order to avoid him, and it worked for a while, as I only had 2 other encounters with him afterward. The first of these was the only time he had seen me out with my boyfriend of the time. We were walking around and of course crossed paths with the guy. He did his normal stop and stare, but I saw his eyes narrow onto our held hands, and he just made the creepiest smile, one which made my heart sink. I made us leave shortly after and explained to my boyfriend. The second, I would ride the light rail, a kind of trolley or train for public transport in my city, and whether he followed me onto it or just happened across me I am unsure of, but he walked past me and sat a few seats ahead of me, facing me directly. We just deadlocked stared at each other, and I feared he was going to wait for my stop, but he ended up getting off a few stops before shooting me one last glare. It's been years since I've last seen him, but thinking about him never ceases to make me uncomfortable. I never quite understood why he had such anger and a kind of obsession with me. He really was an attractive guy, so you'd imagine one cancelled meetup wouldn't lead to all of this. Maybe he wasn't used to being turned down given he was so handsome. Maybe he didn't like being turned down despite the reason by a younger Hispanic. Maybe he was just plain crazy. In any case, I'm glad I didn't meet with him, and I hope to never see him again. 3. Please be aware the following story contains one brief, minor reference to animal cruelty. This story begins sometime around my junior year of high school. I was 15 years old and in that phase of my life where I didn't listen to anyone, yet at the same time was completely impressionable. At the beginning of the year I was sitting in my 6th period chem class, probably zoned out, looking at my phone under the clunky grey lab table, when I heard 2 people laughing to my right. The way the classroom was set up was a long rectangle, so essentially, the teacher wouldn't really be able to hear what was going on in the back. The people laughing were a guy and a girl, Eric and Callie. They were somewhat popular. Not the top of the food chain by any means, but everyone knew them. My younger sister knew Eric. They had a tennis match a month or 2 earlier. Eric was really funny. This is a crucial element to this story. He was definitely the class clown. He was tall, good-looking, and extremely charismatic. I wasn't attracted to him, but I could see why everyone else was. I think it was at this point in time where I made one of the most regrettable decisions of my life. I decided I wanted to be friends with Eric. Eric was in my 2nd, 5th, and 6th periods. The next morning, I poked him in the back in Spanish class. "Hey," I said, "I heard my sister kicked your ass in tennis." He turned around with a goofy smile, his friends all looking at me. "Who's your sister?" His voice had a specific cadence to it. "Karen," I replied. I don't remember the rest of this encounter, but I'm pretty sure he denied losing the tennis match. I think the conversation ended shortly thereafter, and my day continued until I saw him in math class. Algebra 2 was one of those classes where the teacher would lecture for a while, give us homework, and then let us have the rest of the period to work on it, so we wouldn't have to do it when we got home. I was looking at my paper, probably confused, when I hear a familiar voice. "Hey, girl." I looked down and saw Eric crouched next to my desk on the floor. "What's up?" He started asking me about tennis, and once I said that I played, a huge smile spread across his face. I think this is when he latched onto me. He asked for my phone number and I gave it to him. That day in our next period he introduced me to Callie. She was older and really intimidating. I had never met anyone like her, and I was beginning to get excited at the prospect of these new, interesting friends. That night he kept texting me non-stop. He would ask me questions and then would reply, "Ha ha 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 ha," to everything I said. I thought it was weird, but that was just his humor. After this day, he didn't leave my side. We spent most of the school day together and then would be in constant contact after school. This was 2011, so we were mostly on Facebook or doing group phone calls with Callie and 2 other friends of mine I had brought into the group, Sasha and Natalie. There were lots of red flags. Eric wanted me to hold hands with him at school and told everyone he had taken my virginity. For some reason, this wasn't something I got too mad about. I just thought it was weird. He would say, "Your virginity belongs to me." Again, I assumed it was a joke. I always assumed Eric wasn't attracted to girls, because he said he wasn't, although he would have sex with them and then tell everyone, making fun of them. We would walk down the hallway after 5th period, and he would stop for a group of freshman girls waiting for him, to give them each a peck on the lips. One time we were walking to the bus, and there was a girl about 10 feet in front of us. She was cheating on her boyfriend, which I whispered to him, pointing her out. Yes, it was childish, but keep in mind this was high school and I was 15. He proceeds to run towards her and stops her, only to point at me and tell her what I said. She came over and yelled at me, and he watched, laughing. A few months into the friendship, I began sneaking out with Eric, bringing him alcohol from my dad's liquor cabinet. Eric was a heavy drinker, especially considering our age. This came to a head when he asked Callie and I to come over one night. His dad was in prison and his mom was in rehab, so he lived with his grandparents. We pulled up outside of his house and his car wasn't there. We waited for a while, and finally he sped into the neighborhood and stumbled out of the driver's side wasted. We followed him inside. His grandparents weren't home. I don't know what I said, but next thing I know he grabs a knife off the kitchen counter and charges at me. I took off running and made it into Callie's car, slamming the door shut and locking it. He stares at me through the window before bursting out in laughter. My heart was racing and my blood ran cold. Callie got into the car and we left. I don't know why I stuck around. It was like an abusive relationship. He told me he was the only guy who would ever find me attractive, but somehow it would turn into a joke and I would let it go. I believe the breaking point was when I heard about the baby squirrel. He had found a live baby squirrel after school and brought it home. His grandparents said they didn't want it in the house, so he walked outside and tossed it into the retention pond before walking back in. I wasn't there for that, but it disgusted me. In algebra, a few days later, he knocked my pen off my desk and called me a bitch. "Eric, I don't want to be friends with you anymore," I told him firmly. "Don't talk to me." His head snapped back, and he moved to the desk in front of mine. "You won't be able to ignore me," he laughed. "I know where to find you." "I'm going to college next year," I reminded him. "You'll never be able to get away from me." "Are you threatening me?" "Yes." I know this sounds like a cheesy horror movie, but that was our exchange word for word. The next week was endless phone calls and him trying to get me to talk to him at school. At first it was jovial, when he thought I was going to change my mind. And then he came up to me in math class and opened his backpack. Inside were several large kitchen knives. "In case there's a zombie attack." Another big smile. I should have told the teacher at that point, I really should have. But it wasn't until a few days later when he pushed me too far. "I'm going to rape you, then murder you, and I'll make Natalie film it." I went to the dean's office and told him everything. I had grown up being told not to snitch, but I couldn't focus in class anymore. I had been a good kid. I'd never been in trouble, so they believed me when I told them. Here's the kicker. They called him into the office and he admitted to everything, nodded, smiling, confirming all of the stories I told them. Dean Thomas sat me down the next day and told me that I needed to call the police. They said that there was clearly something wrong with him, and that he didn't get it. They put a school version of a restraining order on him. he wasn't to talk to me, and during tests, he had to be taken to a separate classroom. He would do everything he could to get around those rules. He would talk about me right in front of my face, but wasn't technically talking to me. He said out loud to the class, "Some girl put a restraining order on me because she thinks I'm dangerous." A teacher laughed and said, "Doesn't she know you're joking? That's just you being Eric." The backlash I faced was enormous. All of his groupies shunned me and laughed at me. Even my own friends said I was overreacting. Except for Natalie. She was always intuitive. She said he made her feel uncomfortable, and had started following her from class to class. When his birthday came, he approached me with Callie, and Callie said, "He wants you to wish him a happy birthday." Eventually, a mutual friend called me and told me Eric had threatened to kill himself if I wouldn't talk to him again. I went back to the dean's office, and this time every dean, vice principal, and even the principal got involved. My school was big, and there were 550 kids in my class. The school year ended, and without the protection of the authorities there, I was fielding more phone calls, and when I blocked his number, he would call me on Callie's phone. He would drive around my neighborhood to see if my car was in the driveway. He even came to my tennis matches, the ones we initially bonded over. I could see his silhouette in the fence watching me. By senior year, things had calmed down. His attention was elsewhere, and I had picked my classes with the dean to ensure we weren't in any together. He was still watching. I would be walking down the hallway with someone he didn't know, and all of a sudden he would be walking with us, next to my unassuming friend. "Hi, I'm Eric. Nice to meet you." He told my friends he had decided to wait for me because we were soulmates, and I'd come around eventually. I graduated high school and moved out of town. I told my new college friends that if something ever happened to me, he was the one who did it. And that's all. There's no conclusion, really, except he always knows when I come into town. I don't know how, because I have him blocked on everything. I suspect he still checks my house. He's been arrested since, on drug charges and a few DUIs. I'm looking at his mugshots as I write this, to remember those dead eyes. Sometimes I think maybe I overreacted. Maybe it was all a joke. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 3 True Scary Stories, episode 279. Thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. Well, this is going to be an exhausting day for me. I'm currently recording this story at 10:30 in the morning, which is, given that I'm a nighttime person, I should actually be in bed sleeping at this point. But I'm waiting on UPS picking up a defective bicycle, which is going to be returned to Amazon, and who knows when they're going to arrive for that. It could be any time during the day. I'm hoping for sooner rather than later, but, well, yeah, we'll see. And with that, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.